Hey folks, so George Soros is a Hungarian billionaire, and he's become kind of a fixation of the right wing in the United States. The guy tends to be associated with the Democratic Party. He's associated with a lot of what you might call socially liberal causes. And the right wing in the United States tends to refer to everything that they don't like as communism. So there seems to be this widespread misconception that George Soros is a communist or a Marxist. And if you listen to the far right wing speak, they'll call him, even that lady, she even thinks he's a Marxist or a communist. Well, if you listen to the right wing and the way they talk, you would believe that this Hungarian billionaire, George Soros, is a Marxist or a communist. Well, the reality is, George Soros hates communism. You look at George Soros' career, if you look at what he's done throughout his life, it's been mainly fighting against communism. George Soros was a bankroller of the protests against the governments in Eastern Europe that were Marxist-Leninist. In East Germany, in Romania, Czechoslovakia, in Russia, different places in the 1980s, late 80s, George Soros was funding people to protest and eventually work with the CIA to bring down Marxist communist governments. That's actually the whole history of George Soros is anti-communism. Furthermore, you ought to listen to what George Soros just recently said at the World Economic Forum in Davos, I should say. George Soros was speaking at the World Economic Forum, and he said that China was the greatest threat to his vision of an open society, that China was the greatest opponent of his vision of an open society. And he went on to attack technology. George Soros said that because China is utilizing technology and is promoting artificial intelligence and computers and making advancements in technology, this is helping them to build some kind of totalitarian society. And so that China is so dangerous, that China, led by a communist party, President Xi Jinping, is so dangerous because it is, pioneering technology and advancing computers and utilizing that in its state-run economy. So if you think George Soros is a Marxist or a communist or a socialist, you're just wrong. George Soros is a good friend of capitalism. And a lot of people don't seem to understand that there are a lot of capitalists that are socially liberal, right? That there's a whole history of capitalists who think that capitalism works better when there's a little bit of a welfare state. When there's, efforts to include people of different backgrounds, when there's efforts to empower women, they think that it's better to have a kinder and gentler capitalism so that people don't rise up. And that this division within the ruling class is long-standing, and it tends to be the wealthier capitalists who are more left-wing, right? They see it, hey, we can afford to be taxed more, right? Warren Buffett, the billionaire, he famously said, tax me more. Why does my secretary have a higher tax rate than I do, right? And the richest of the rich, they don't tend to believe all the free market nonsense. They tend to understand that, you need government oversight to try and stabilize the economy. They tend to have more of a Keynesian outlook. They still believe in capitalism. They still hate Marxism and socialism and communism with every bone in their body, but they're thinking long-term about it, and they're thinking more realistically about it. It's the lower levels of the rich, right? Those rags to riches stories, those people that are maybe they're millionaires and billionaires, but they're not part of the club. They're not the entrenched circles of wealth, Rockefellers, Carnegies, and DuPonts. They're not part of that. They're lower level capitalists. Maybe they own a chain of hotels. Maybe they own a fracking company that's competing with the big oil companies. It's the lower levels of capital that tend to be your hard right wing. They want to just completely deregulate everything. They resent the fact that the entrenched circles of power have been able to, get the government on their side, and that they resent the fact that they don't get to write the regulations. They don't have as much influence. They tend to be more libertarian and free market. So that's the division. There's long-standing divisions. The richest of the rich tend to be more socially liberal and favor more of a welfare state, and the lower levels of the rich want to completely deregulate everything. But at the end of the day, they both hate Marxism and socialism and communism. They are opposed to the workers controlling the major centers of economic power and a state-run economy. They oppose, Russia, China, countries rising around the globe, Venezuela, different countries that have seized control of their economies and have begun to develop independently. They're opposed to that. But there's a difference in strategy. George Soros is not a Marxist. He's not a socialist. He's not a communist. George Soros is a good friend of capitalism. What he did with the color revolutions during the 1980s was a huge boost to capitalism by rolling back the Soviet Union and basically beating down Eastern Europe, bringing the free market in and just gutting Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. It was a disaster in the 1990s, a disaster largely brought to you by George Soros, and now he's taking aim at China. George Soros is not a Marxist, and he's not a communist, and the right wing in the USA has no clue what it's talking about.